This Georgia Department of Education screencast is intended for teachers of 4th grade social studies to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Life at the turn of the century was a time of great change in America. With the Civil War having ripped the fabric of our nation in two, and the painful process of stitching it back together again underway in the South, many Americans were looking for new lives and new opportunities and began seeking their fortunes further west. In contrast, the Northeast continued to grow in population and specialize in industry over agriculture, creating a demand for beef. In this screencast, we will look at how some enterprising ranchers in Texas applied the basic economic concepts of trade, opportunity cost, and price incentives to make a tidy profit by driving the cattle to the northern railroads using the Chisholm Trail and eventually the Great Western Cattle Trail. Among these new cowboys in Texas were the many recently freed slaves seeking an alternative to sharecropping, known as the Black Cowboys of Texas. Students in our more urban areas of Georgia may be very unfamiliar with the agricultural practice of raising cattle, and even those in rural areas that are familiar with cows will know it from the standpoint of modern agricultural practices, and will still find the practice of the long drives to the railroad unfamiliar and interesting. This is a great opportunity to bring in some supplemental resources about the days of the Wild West cowboy, if you so choose. Nothing calls up images of the wild, wild West, with its dusty but heroic cowboys in their 10-gallon hats and their piercing gazes, like the words cattle drive. Despite what Holly would have us believe, though, driving cattle on a trail was a rather long and dreary affair marked by long stretches of hard work and short moments of great potential for danger. The truly large cattle drives of the American West began in 1866, after the end of the Civil War, when many men returned home to Texas after the fighting was over. A cattle drive generally began in the spring, after rounding up the cattle that had overwintered mostly by roaming free and grazing on the tall winter grasses. Cows that were deemed sellable were separated from the rest and given a brand to mark who owned them. Since the average cattle drive consisted of nearly 2,000 to 3,000 cows, cattle drives often had cows coming from different owners, and since many drives happened in the spring and summer of each year, the cows were also given a trail brand to notate what trail herd they were a part of. Once the cows were branded and ready to go, they were given over to the trail boss and the 10 to 12 cowboys who would be responsible for getting them some 1,000 miles north to Kansas. These cowboys could expect to be on the trail for 2 months or more, crossing dangerous and inhospitable lands in all kinds of weather. Once on the trail, the cattle tended to spread out in a long line that could stretch for more than a mile. The cowboys usually worked in pairs scattered along the line, keeping the cows moving and from wandering off. While the cattle and cowboys were capable of walking more than 20 miles a day, they would lose too much weight, and by extension, too much value, traveling at those speeds, so they usually traveled 10 to 15 miles a day, stopping once at midday for lunch, and then again in the evening for the night. The cattle drive was accompanied by the cook, who drove the chuck wagon. The chuck wagon was invented by Charles Goodnight specifically for the purpose of keeping the tired cowboys supplied and fed on their long journey. The cook was considered such an important job that he generally got paid $10 to $15 more than the drovers, who were paid about $30 a month. The food on the trail generally consisted of beef, beans, and biscuits, with water or coffee to drink. Your students may appreciate the lack of vegetables in the cowboys' diet. It wasn't that they didn't like their spinach, though. I suspect that may be true. It was that fresh produce was just too bulky and hard to keep on the trail. While daily life on the trail was dusty and tedious, there were moments of great danger. The weather could be very unpredictable, and a lightning strike could spook the cattle and cause a stampede. At best, the torrential summer rains would cause rivers to flood and creeks to swell, making for dangerous river crossings. Cowboys referred to crossing a rain-flooded river as "big swimmin'." In addition to the natural dangers of the trail, cowboys also had to contend with cattle rustlers trying to steal the cattle, and the Comanche and the Kiowas attacking the drive. Add to that the fact that herding cows is difficult and physical work. If a cowboy got sick or injured, the cook carried basic first aid supplies, but there was no doctor nearby. It is not surprising that many cowboys, after finally making it to the railhead in Kansas and turning over the responsibility for the cows, decided not to do it again. So why did they do it in the first place? Well, the answer to that is simple: money. The economic rules of supply and demand say that when supply is high and demand is low, you cannot charge a high price. But when supply is low and demand is high, you can charge a very high price. Ranchers could sell cattle for $4 a head in the South, where cattle ranches were plentiful. But in the North, where you had large cities and very few cattle ranches, they could get $40 a head. At this same time, Philip Danforth Armour opened his Armour and Company meat packaging business in Chicago, and he would buy lots of cattle that he would package and sell to markets in the East. Unfortunately, the nearest railheads were in Abilene, Kansas. And what is the easiest way to get over 2,000 cows weighing a half-ton each to Kansas? Make them walk there on their own. The first cattle trail began using the route a trader by the name of Jesse Chisholm used to travel between his various trading posts. The trail became known as the Chisholm Trail. Later, as more settlers moved west and complained about the cattle stomping through their land, the cattle drives moved further west to a trail named the Great Western Cattle Trail. The great cattle trails of the American West were surprisingly short-lived. In total, they lasted only about 20 years. The expansion of the railroad into the South eliminated the need, and the invention of barbed wire fencing, combined with more and more people settling the West as a part of westward expansion, closed off the portion of the trail to the north. Life for many former slaves in the South was little better than it had been before the Civil War. Upon being freed, the former slaves found that they had few options open to them. They had never been paid, and so they had no money. It was illegal to educate a slave, and while some were able to attain some education in secret, most had never had the opportunity to learn to read and write, or add and subtract. In fact, it could even be dangerous for them to be caught with a book that they were not carrying for their master. And so they found themselves working as sharecroppers on the very same plantations they had once been slaves. Because despite their freedom, white wealthy landowners still held all of the power. Sharecropping was rigged against them from the start. On top of all of this, you had groups like the White League and the KKK making sure they did not step out of line. Some of the young former slaves decided to try their luck out west, where they were told they could earn decent pay if they were willing to work hard, and they headed out to Texas cattle ranches to become cowboys. Some researchers have put the number of black cowboys at more than 5,000, while others say it may have been as high as 8,000 to 9,000, or nearly a quarter of the cowboys working for the ranching industry in the West. Conditions for cowboys were hard and dangerous, and the black cowboys of Texas were no exception. But at least they were probably treated more fairly than they would have been in the Southeast. Prejudice and discrimination were still prevalent, but many cowboys were far more willing to judge a man by his courage, ability with horses, and the sweat and blood he shed on the job, than by the color of his skin. For the most part, they slept and worked side by side with, and received the same pay as, white cowboys, and had mostly the same opportunities to advance to cook or trail boss, which were higher paying than the drovers and wranglers. There is much speculation as to why, despite the fact that on any given trail crew, generally 2 or 3 of the 12 cowboys would be African American, there is little mentioned about them in the history of the times. Unfortunately, much of the history and stories of the West were written by people who were not actually from there. Easterners came out to the rugged, wild West and found it all so very romantic and adventurous, and they brought their prejudices with them. The people living out west rarely had time to write about it, as they were much too busy working. Some stories of the brave men who were the black cowboys of Texas can be found, but they are few and far between. Here are just a few you may consider looking into a bit more deeply to help your students get a glimpse of the lives of these hard-working frontiersmen. Bosie Ickard was born into slavery in Mississippi and served his master in Louisiana until Dr. Ickard moved west to Texas. You may recall that most slaves took the last name of their masters. When freedom came, with the end of the Civil War, he went to work for Oliver Loving, who was partners with Charles Goodnight, of the Goodnight-Loving Trail fame. The Goodnight-Loving Trail was the westernmost trail of the major cattle trails. After Loving died, he continued to work for Charles Goodnight, who you may remember from earlier was the inventor of the chuck wagon. Then there is Daniel Webster Wallace, who was born the son of slaves, and spent the first 17 years of his life working in the cotton fields, at which time he decided to head west and join a cattle drive. Wallace saved most of the money he earned and was eventually able to buy his own herd and the land to raise them on. By all accounts he was a highly respected rancher, and at the time of his death his Texas ranch was worth over $1 million. I'm afraid that is all we have time for in this screencast, but you can find links to resources for these and other black cowboys of Texas in the helpful resources list at the end of this screencast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources where you can find more information as well as the works used in the creation of this screencast.